to invite Dr. Piotr Pierzak to make his presentation. And the floor is yours. You can share it, and we are listening to you very attentively.
Of course, thank you much for the invitation. Thank you much for giving me the opportunity to present. Let me just screen my presentation. Do you say that in Georgian, Dia Mishiva Biza? Good morning to
Dilan
everyone.
Shpigobisa. Yes, we say Dilan Shpigobisa.
Okay,
Sure.
great, amazing. So in that case, uh, my presentation today could be a bit controversial, but it's just a topic. The topic might sound silly to some people, but it's not. I intend to talk about serious matters, uh, and it is a hypothesis basically. So some researchers, some feminist researchers and IR researchers suggested that if Vladimir Putin was a woman or were a woman, there would be peace in Eastern Europe, in North Caucasus, and Bashar al-Assad would not be ruling Syria. That some
Good
say
idea.
that Russian people would be much more prosperous if women would rule the country. By extension, this could be the same argument could be said about the entire world, as a matter of fact, because we still suffer this man-made disadvantage for women. It's predominantly men who um, rule the world, but in Europe, after retirement of Mrs. Merkel, Chancellor Merkel, there is no real leadership in the European Union, so that says it all. But yes, we will approach this matter through the perspective of IR theory, feminist IR theory. Basically, that's the hypothesis which I want to explore today. My main assumption is that we should encourage women to enter politics, and that should be done for the sake of the world peace. And we will discuss a couple of things. I will try to keep this presentation as short as possible. I anticipate that it will be around 15, maybe 20 minutes. So thank you much for your patience with me. First of all, I would like to thank everyone for organizing this event. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here today, although online, but maybe one day I will travel to Georgia to meet with you in person. A few words about me. I'm an IR thinker, political philosopher, and ontologist. I'm interested in conflict management, conflict resolution. I try to approach various conflicts from various perspectives in order to find a solution to certain things which are happening in the world. Um, I'm a lecturer at Sofia University. I am also a postdoctoral researcher at Airlangga University in Indonesia. One thing which I would like to suggest is straight away is the fact that from my perspective there is nothing romantic about the war, and I don't buy the good versus evil team when both sides, when two sides or more sides are trying to keep fighting and affect the civilian populations at large. So basically, I'm a bit humanitarian who always looks at the conflict, international conflict, from the perspective of civilians on the ground. I recently came up with the idea of ontology instead of understanding, and that is a supplement and the new hybridized compartmentalization of IR theory, which suggests to bring everyone to the table to discuss important matter in broader way by looking into various perspectives. And I think that feminist IR theories and feminism in general offers this unique opportunity to basically be open-minded about certain debates, But yet, I'm still a humble student of feminist IR theory. The pluralism and diversity of the IR theory is surely making this approach very strong, and it's good to actually acquaint yourself with this one. Basically, my recent work started incorporating some feminist IR theory themes. In the last year, we've published one special edition with Institutional Study on feminism and gender equality with my colleague Venera Russo, who will graduate her PhD soon, basically. And we've managed to attract some work to this publication, predominantly philosophers. And IR theories also should adopt feminist theory, simply because women experience continues to be excluded from the study of IR theory, and indeed should be treated as an integral part of this tradition. And I completely agree with that, because the feminists, the IR feminist thinkers, fight for the world without man-made disadvantage, and this is important to just deal with these stereotypes, prejudices, biases, and sexist attitudes towards women, and try to find a way to annihilate them in science, in politics, in the society, basically. Uh, IR feminism is very strong simply because um, it started addressing issues such as harassment in the military, successfully deals with matters related to sex trafficking, war related prostitution in a very systematic manner. Thanks to the IR feminists, such term as rape as a weapon of war was coined, which indicates the use of rape to exert control, intimidate, and exercise power over local populations in conquered lands. And this is very characteristic to the Russia's war in Ukraine and many other wars in the post-Soviet areas, but we'll focus now on Ukraine. Basically, there is a case made against Russian troops who invaded Ukraine, that they started using the rape during the hostilities, and they tried to intimidate the local populations with their crimes against humanity. And this is something which feminist IR theorists started paying a lot of attention to, because not only that, Ukrainian women suffered a long period of misogynic abuse and objectification by their employers and family members in their society, but also when Russia invaded Ukraine, women became the first victims of the Russian aggression. In my recent work, in my recent papers related to Putinization of the situation in Ukraine, I suggested that the crimes, the CRSV related crimes, conflict related sexual violence, has been committed not only on Ukrainian women but also men and children. There is an ample evidence suggesting this fact. The wartime inflicted crimes of rape, sexual slavery, forced prostitution, and forced pregnancies, forced abortions, and forced sterilization, and forced marriages are this type of conflict related violence, and this is definitely something which we need to pay special attention. The feminism in Russia, the strongly opposing the war in Ukraine, the same was happening in Chechnya when Russian troops wanted to subjugate Chechen insurgency during the first Chechen war and the second Chechen war. Not only that, the Russian troops used the rape during the conflict against the Chechen women, but also they flattened the capital of Chechnya, Grozny, and they unleashed a heavy bombing campaign. Cities and towns were reduced to rubble. Thousands or hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed during this conflict. Similarly, the recent experiences of Syrian women suggest that certain atrocities which were committed both from the hands of Russian troops and Syrian troops, and Al Qaeda, ISIS, Al Nusra Front, and also Free Syrian Army, suggest that the parties who engage in the conflict very often use forbidden by international law tactics and strategies which basically affect them. The feminism in Georgia also was very strongly opposing the Russian invasion of 2008. The atrocities committed in Georgia are lesser than the ones committed in Ukraine and Syria, surely, but still we need to pay attention to the experiences of Georgian women, the members of minorities in Georgia as well during the 2008 war, the experiences of women in Abkhazia and South Ossetia suggest that there were also certain crimes committed during this conflict. The Amnesty International accused Russia of deliberately bombarding and attacking civilian areas and infrastructure, which is a war crime. And additionally, the Russian military did very little or nothing to prevent the ethnic cleansing of Georgians in South Ossetia and under their control. So um, feminism in Ukraine actually is very strong, especially these days. Ukrainian women these days, ever since February 2022, support the world effort of Ukraine against Russia. And they are on the second line of basically defending the country by preparing meals, sewing the military uniforms, and very often provide military with intelligence. This is something which is asked of women, despite of the fact that it is commonly believed that it's only men who fight during the war. This is completely not true, because a big proportion of Ukrainian women joined Ukrainian army, as a matter of fact, and the proportion is between 15 and 20%, as a matter of fact. So when it comes to Russia, Russian Federation, and Vladimir Putin activities in the region, that is something which is definitely on the edge of genocide, and definitely certain actions can be clustered as human rights violations and war crimes. Um, Amnesty International reported ever since 2014 such crimes committed like murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, mass systematic rape and sexual enslavement in the time of war, and other inhumane acts. Russia's crimes committed in Syria, the very fact that Russia decided to support the genocidal regime of Bashar al-Assad and extended his rule in the country suggests that Vladimir Putin and his generals have very little regard for human rights and women's rights in Syria. There are crimes committed in Ukraine ever since February 2022 are just very well reported. The Bucha massacre, the Borodyanka war crimes, the Irpin massacre, the Hostomel war crimes, the siege of Mariupol, the Mariupol drama theater attacks, the Izium mass graves, Mariupol hospital airstrike, and so on and so forth. We can talk for hours how many kindergartens, hospitals, schools Russian military sheltered, attacked with the predominantly intention to kill civilians, to kill women, to kill children. This is something which is definitely in my report, which I recently published for Instat Onestanti, in article titled "Putinization of the Situation of Women and Children in Ukraine." And the ferocity of Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 shows that this country has already become an unpredictable international actor governed by an unpredictable man who is very selective in his understanding of the letter of international law. What I want to emphasize is that the crimes committed by Russian soldiers in Ukraine constitute a sobering reminder that the most brutal behavior can still be cynically weaponized for political purposes even in 21st century. Um, and also, we need to understand in the conflict, in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, is that it's not only Ukrainian people who suffer, it's also Russian minority in Ukraine that suffered between 2014 and 2023. There are certain crimes which are committed by Ukrainians, or certain not atrocities, but by certain individual crimes which should be discussed as well. Since 2014, the Russian government has repeatedly accused Ukraine of genocide against the locals in Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea, and the territories under Ukrainian control. The most of these accusations are completely groundless, but there are some crimes that cannot be denied. And this is, for instance, the situation in Odessa in 2014, when the newly elected authorities in Kiev uh, could not stop the massacre which happened in Odessa, and 48 people died during this massacre when the Ukrainian protesters set on fire the trade union house, and more than 200 people were injured. So those crimes suggest that it's not only one side that is committing certain war crimes, atrocities, and acts of genocide, it's also Ukraine as well. And this is not something which you will hear in the discourse which is presented by the Western media, because Western media tries to portray the conflict as one-sided, that it is Russia who is only committing certain crimes and atrocities, but the crimes which were happening on the
Oh,
civilians.
sorry, Piotr.
Yeah.
Can you summarize? Because we have, time limit here.
Yeah,
And
of course. Yeah, I will
sorry, sorry.
summarize. I need another 5 minutes if you don't mind.
Yes, please.
Sure.
Yes.
So
Sorry.
basically, in Donbass, around 3 million to 6.5 million people, out of 6.5 million people who live there, fled the region because of the crimes committed. Approximately 6,500 Russian separatist forces were killed, and 4,400 Ukrainian forces were killed, and approximately 3,500 civilians on both sides have been killed. So the crimes are evident on both sides, as a matter of fact. And this is something which is reported by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, OSCE, the UN. The UN reports mass human rights violations between this period, between 2014 and 2022. So my point is that sometimes poking the bear is not something which is a rational strategy, because there is retaliation which is happening for certain crimes committed, as a matter of fact. On the other hand, Russia tries to poke NATO at the moment, so this is an ongoing confrontation, and various warmongers around the world try to make the Ukrainian conflict longer than it should. Both sides are not happy to find the compromise. They don't want to sit at the negotiation table and find a compromise. And now I will just quickly, briefly brush on my hypothesis. Basically, from my perspective, we cannot say that if Putin was a woman, there would be a peace, because even if politicians in the West suggest that, like for instance Boris Johnson, who suggests that the Putin's behavior in Eastern Europe is an example of toxic masculinity, and what he's doing in Ukraine or Georgia or in Syria is extremely toxic. The toxic masculinity is something which is a new concept. This is a term that has been gaining traction in the past few years, and the term refers to dominant form of masculinity wherein men use dominance, violence, and control to assert their power and superiority. But the question is what Margaret Thatcher was doing in Falkland War. How do we explain that? and how do we explain Catherine the Great, partitions of Poland, and the expansion of the Russian Empire beyond the horizon? Was that a toxic femininity, a dominant form of femininity, wherein women use dominance, violence, and control to regain their power and superiority? Or just an example of the fact that certain women try to be more assertive in the world of politics, that men try to dominate? If Putin were a woman, uh, Putin, a female, would still operate in certain unpredictable structure of power. So the chances are that if Putin in fact was a woman, he would have be as hawkish, as unpredictable, and as ruthless as anyone around him. If the president of Russian Federation would be a woman one day, we can check the validity of this thesis. If, for instance, Miss Elvira Nabiulina or Maria Zakharova or Natalia Pakloinskaya will become a Russian president one day, then we would be able to come back to this thesis and try it, whether it's toxic masculinity or toxic femininity, basically. So that is the point which I want to make today. And I also want to suggest that we need to supplement our IR theory deliberations with feminism, gender, and various new thinkers such as Simone de Beauvoir, Cynthia Enloe, Lucy Irigaray, and Julia Kristeva, because their work is very strong and it definitely helps to bring to light a lot of new things which are important from the perspective of analysis. I rest my case, and thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much for your in detailed presentation.